So thank you all for coming out. We might be here for a while. And you'll have to excuse me because there's a lot of detail in here. I'm going to have to look at my notes quite often, so I hate to do that when I give a program, but please bear with me. So we are talking about Mary Todd Lincoln's family that was here in Alabama. So it's important, though, that we get a little bit of background information. Abraham Lincoln said about the Todd family, apparently there wasn't the greatest relationship he had with them. Well, shocking. He said 1 D was good enough for God Almighty, but only 2 Ds would suffice for the Todd family. And her father was married twice. There were 17 children between the 2 wives. And the first one died as a result of childbirth. Yes, as a result of childbirth. So the Todd ancestors came from Scotland, Ireland, and England, and her grandfather had fought in the American Revolution. They were from a very wealthy family, and they had settled the town of Lexington, Kentucky. And they had an estate there. The grandfather built the estate called Ellerslie. He owned 7,000 acres and had 21 slaves. The home was torn down. It is now a shopping center that was taken over where the Todd family home was. The family had lived for a while. Now, one of the homes is still standing, and this is kind of a cute story. After Lincoln and Mary had married and had several children, apparently the children were hellions. And they were on a train one day, and this man was describing these horrible children, and the parents weren't doing anything to try to stop it. Well, he was on the train with them. He had gone to see the Todd family in Lexington, and he was talking about these horrible children, and he looks out the window, and there comes Abraham and Mary and those children walking up to the same house, and he excused himself and went out the back door and did not have any more time to see with them, more time with them. Lincoln supposedly was on a train one day, and this woman was staring at him, and she said, "You are the most unattractive man I've ever seen." And he said, "Well, I can't help it." And she said, "But you could stay home." That's awful, isn't it? So Mary and Abraham had met through her sister, who was married to a man named Ninian Edwards. And they became engaged rather quickly. And he left to go do his politicking. And when he came back a few months later, he said that she had improved astonishingly. Does anybody know what that means?
Lost weight?
Yeah.
Gained weight. Yes, she got huge. And he had very much fallen out of love with her. And he did not want to marry her. She said, "But you're honor bound to marry me." And he said, he told several people, "I can't stand that woman." And he's told her, "The only reason I'm anywhere near you is because I have fallen in love with your niece. And if I'm around you, I can be near her."
Oh.
Wow. So several years later, though, they met up again, and this time he married her. It was against his will, and somebody had asked him, "Well, where are you going?" He was about to go get married. "Where are you going?" "To hell, I believe." So I'm just going to throw this out there reading between the lines. Why do you think he was honor bound to marry her?
They've been pregnant.
They've been fooling around.
Yeah, that's what I think. They had already been fooling around.
Oh.
That's what I think. You didn't know that? You couldn't put that together? He said it would just kill me to marry her. He did it anyway. He was a very depressed person. Maybe before that, I don't know. But she was. Some modern historians believe she suffered from pernicious anemia, which gave her the strange personality that she had. She would chase him around. She threw hot coffee on him one day, locked him outside without his pants on, chased him around with a knife in her hand. And
That was my ex-wife.
I think you should come up and talk. It sounds like a lot more interesting story. But she was mad that he didn't pay enough attention to her. So she was also known to have taken great amounts of money meant for the U.S. government, and she had these outrageous outfits that she would wear, and they would people would complain about her hats. One looked like a milking apparatus. One of them looked like a flower pot, and she was known to. And now I say all this. This is what is written. So I mean I wasn't there, but remember when Fergie was selling people, letting people pay for her to get a meeting with her husband, the prince, remember? Well, that's what Mary was doing. And also to get jobs, too. And of course, Lincoln didn't know this. Supposedly, he wouldn't have approved of that. But I think he was just, afraid of her, done with her. I don't know. She denied herself nothing, and her excesses were legendary. He was known to sit at the dinner table and forget to eat. He was so deep in thought, just forget to eat. Okay, well, let's turn to the Todd family now that we have that background information. 17 children, there's bound to be a few disagreements here and there. Anybody from a large family here? Okay, I mean, if there's more than one sibling, there's going to be somebody that's a little off, right? Just saying.
Yeah, Ricky.
Yes, I did.
There were 5 of the Todd sons or sons-in-law who were at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. Samuel Todd was shot on the second day when the army was retreating. He was shot in the back, left the gaping hole in his gut where his intestines came out. Probably I could have left that out since we just ate. And he said that he knew he was a goner. They put him on a wagon and they were taking him into Corinth to see a doctor, but he died along the way, and they buried him there by the road. And it was several months later when one of his brothers came and dug him up and buried him back in Lexington. Alec Todd, another one of the brothers, was killed later that year near Baton Rouge. It was in August of 1862. And Alec was one of the favorites of the second family. Most of the second family was pro-Confederate. Most of the first family was pro-Union. Alec was one of the favorites as a child. The family had caught one of the nannies holding him upside down and shaking him until his face had turned black. So he had been sort of pampered for the rest of his very short life. About time you got here, Lee.
I know, I'm sorry.
As he tries to sneak in. Margaret Todd, one of the sisters, had married a man named Charles Kellogg of Cincinnati. Both of them had attended President Lincoln's inauguration. However, Charles Kellogg was a secret Southern sympathizer, and he had been at Shiloh during the Battle of Shiloh. And as a doctor, he was working in the hospital there trying to take care of the Confederate soldiers. Kellogg had spent some time, about 10 days in Huntsville, when he came through with Colonel Benjamin Hardin Helm of the 1st Kentucky Cavalry. Martha Todd, another sister, we think was the first of the family to live in Selma. I cannot find anywhere why they came to Selma. Does anybody have a clue?
Cotton warehouses, cotton mills,
I don't know.
I think so.
Well, it was because of her that the other families started coming down here. This was sort of their unofficial home away from home for the Confederate side of the Todd family. So a lot of them were in and out of Selma. And
That's where the ammunition was made.
Yeah.
but why was her husband there? I mean, they were there.
Connected to laminations, all I'm thinking.
Well, they were there before the war started.
Oh, okay.
So, but why I don't know. She had attended Jefferson Davis's inauguration, and her husband had enlisted in the Confederate Army, but he was too skinny to stay in, so he was sent home. And he had taken a job after the war was over in Anna, Illinois, and the family had moved there in 1868, and very shortly after they moved there, she passed away. And all it says, the obituary that I could find, was that it was a short illness. And so she was buried then in Lexington. And I'm taking you from the beginning of these relatives, from the beginning to the end, so it's not in chronological order, because that makes it a lot more confusing. Elodie Todd was another one of the sisters. And she met her future husband, Nathaniel Dawson, also at Jefferson Davis's inauguration. He lived in Selma, but he had lost 2 wives to childbirth. And while they had fallen in love, he was reluctant to marry her because of losing already 2 wives. But they did get married, and guess how she died? Childbirth, at the age of 37. This was in 1877. The doctor had given her a very strong shot of morphine that made her unconscious, and she suddenly gave birth to a stillborn baby boy. And so she is buried in Selma. This is what's kind of interesting, though. Her husband was so grieved about her death that he had a statue made in Italy to put over her grave. But when it arrived, he didn't like the way that the hair looked. So he had the statue sent back to Italy and had it reworked. And so it was brought back, and it's there in Selma today. She and her sister Martha were responsible for having a statue of a Confederate soldier put in the cemetery there. And she insisted that she be buried within sight of that statue. And her husband is also buried there. Her son, later on, of course, much later on, became a sheriff of Dallas County, and in 1925 he was killed in the line of duty. Her husband ran for governor but was defeated by General O'Neill from North Alabama, and he died at the age of 65, having lost 3 wives in childbirth. Martha and her sister Elodie had made a battle flag for Company C of the 4th Alabama Infantry. And Elodie was the president of the Ladies Memorial Association. That's why she insisted on this statue being put up there at the cemetery. Kitty Todd was another sister. Now, she had become infatuated with a Union colonel by the name of E.E. Ellsworth. And her brother-in-law, Nathaniel Dawson, said if he saw him, he was going to kill him because he was a Union colonel. Well, on the day that he said that, it was in May of 1861, Ellsworth had been a close friend of Abraham Lincoln, even though there was a big gap in their ages. They were from the same area in Kentucky and had become very close. And Ellsworth had seen a Confederate flag flying over the roof of the Marshall House.
Know it well.
You want to tell that story?
Been there. Yeah.
You want to tell the story?
No, God will listen to you.
Well, but it's still standing, is it? The Marshall House?
Yes,
Very good.
and he did get the flag down, and he was killed.
He was coming down the stairs,
Yes.
and there was a man there that was probably the proprietor. From what I've seen, I think it was him. And he shot him, and the man who was with Ellsworth immediately shot him in the
Shot him,
face.
yep.
Yeah, killed him too. So the flag, apparently Lincoln was very much upset about this, but the flag then that he had taken down, and the reason he wanted it taken down, do you remember that?
Not really.
Because it could be seen from the White House. And he didn't think that Lincoln should be
Yeah.
able to see that
Yeah.
Confederate flag. So the flag was taken to the White House, and Mary had tucked it into a drawer. And later on, when there were some visitors to the White House, they were very much embarrassed because the children had taken it out and they were waving it all over the White House. So it says Lincoln sobbed when he heard the news, but Kitty Todd went on, excuse me, to marry a man named William Wallace Hare. He was a Confederate soldier, and he had helped carry the body of her brother-in-law, Benjamin Hardin Helm, that you're going to hear about in just a minute, after he was killed at Chickamauga. Kitty died as a result of childbirth also, at the age of 33. Benjamin Hardin Helm, is there anybody here who has not heard of him? He was quite well known in the Civil War. He was married to Emily Todd, and he was also a favorite of Lincoln from the same area as well. And Lincoln had told him, look, if you'll join the Union Army, I'll put you in as a paymaster. I'll send you out west, and then you don't have to worry about anybody criticizing you for being in the Union Army, and you don't have to fight against anybody in the Confederate Army, your family or your friends. He said, no, I'm going to enlist in the Confederate Army, and that's what he did. He was a major in the Army, and well, at the time the war started, he was. He formed and led the 1st Kentucky Cavalry and led them at Shiloh, and then he was promoted to general. He led the Kentucky Orphan Brigade at the Battle of Chickamauga. And at 9:30 a.m. on September the 20th, Helm's Kentucky boys and the Alabama boys got within 39 yards of the federal line. Within a matter of minutes, 1/3 of the Orphan Brigade had been cut down. A sharpshooter of the 15th Kentucky Union Infantry shot him in the chest as he sat on his horse. He fell to the ground as the enemy cheered that they had shot and killed a secession general. He was carried off the battlefield, where he was told his wound was fatal. I said he was killed, didn't I? Not yet. Hours later, he asked who had won the battle, and when he was told it was Confederate victory, he said, "Victory, victory, victory," and then he died the next day. His body was removed from Georgia, where he died, and was reburied in Kentucky 20 years later. Soldiers from the Orphan Brigade and the 1st Kentucky Cavalry accompanied his body back to Lexington. The Lincolns were careful not to show any sadness in public, even though they were torn up about this man, his brother-in-law. And so they had to be very careful about that, though. And Emily Helm and her sister Martha were welcomed into the White House right after this happened, where they were all grieving over the deaths of the husband, and also the Lincolns had just lost another one of their sons. And Lincoln had told her, "I tried to have Ben come with me. I hope you do not feel any bitterness or that I'm in any way to blame for all this sorrow." Her answer, "For weal or woe, we must side with our own people." And they never spoke again. Emily said later, "I have been a quiet citizen and request only the right which humanity and justice always gives to widows and orphans. I also would remind you that your many bullets have made us what we are." And she, after the war was over, moved to Louisville, and her nephew, who was Robert Todd Lincoln, gave her a job as a postmistress in Elizabethtown. And they were very active in the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and a chapter named for her husband. She wore black for the rest of her life and died at the age of 93. Elizabeth Humphreys Todd was the second wife of Robert Todd, their father. As I said before, the children, most of those children were pro-Confederate. And she died in 1874 and left instructions and money for a monument which read, "In memory of my boys, Samuel Todd, David Todd, Alexander Todd, all Confederate soldiers." And this is in the Todd section of the Lexington, Kentucky cemetery. Levi Todd, another brother, he was an alcoholic and he died as a result of his drinking. But let's get to David Todd, because that's why we're all here. David Todd was kind of rebellious. And at the age of 15, he ran away from home to fight in the Mexican army. And when he came back, he had a Chilean flag tattooed on his arm. And when he had left, his father said, "Well, thank goodness, they'll make a man out of him." But when he came back, he was a very heavy drinker, and he gambled a lot, so it really didn't do him any good. He was rumored to have died in the Battle of Vicksburg, or the siege of Vicksburg. And for 75 days and nights, there was the constant barrage. The cannonading was recalled as demoralizing music, a chorus of ruin and chaos. If you read anything about the battle or the siege of Vicksburg, it was very unpleasant. They surrendered on July the 4th, and Vicksburg did not celebrate July the 4th for decades and decades later. July the 1st, though, now I'm going to go back in time a little bit. After the Battle of Manassas, there were all of these, there were, let's see, how many? 1,421 prisoners, Union prisoners, that had been taken out of that battle. Well, nobody had thought ahead about where are we going to put them? We've got these prisoners, but now what do we do? So they went to Richmond. They had a lot of empty warehouses, and they decided to set those up as the prisoner of war places for them, the buildings for them, but they didn't have bars on the windows, so David Todd was put in charge, and he was very upset about that. He didn't want to be there. He wanted to be in battle, but he was very cruel to the prisoners as a result. And if anybody stuck their head or their hand out the window, they were shot. He stuck his sword through somebody who got in his way. He was so cruel, they said to some of the prisoners, that even the people of Richmond were unhappy about that and demanded that he be sent somewhere else. That's where he also encountered a spy, which I didn't really plan on talking about, so I guess I'm not, because I can't remember her name. Anyway, talking too loud. So these warehouses ended up becoming a Libby prison, one of the most notorious prisoner of war camps. When the prisoners were brought in, everybody gawked at them and made fun of them. Henry Wirz, is there anybody who doesn't know who Henry Wirz was? He was the commandant of Andersonville, and he was the only person that was executed for war crimes. He was hanged after the war was over. But what they said about Henry Wirz was he wasn't nearly as bad as David Todd. That Henry Wirz was cruel because he thought it pleased his commanding officers. David Todd was cruel because he enjoyed it too much. David Todd also had tuberculosis, and he almost died while he was there as a commandant in Richmond. And so 2 doctors were brought in who had been prisoners, Union prisoners, to take care of him. And doctors have certain oaths. This one in particular that they wrote about in their diary was, even if the person is going to die, which they didn't think he was going to make it through the night, learn something. Do what you can to help him and learn something from the process. Surprisingly, he survived. So when they had come into his apartment, they had seen blood strewn everywhere from his coughing jags. He survived, and a few months later, when he felt well enough, he invited them back to dinner at his apartment to thank them for getting him through that. And when they came in, they saw all sorts of ladies' underwear all strewn about the room. And they said, "Now, we warned you, if you don't straighten up your life, you're going to die." And he said, "I'll not die in bed, I'll die on the battlefield." And we're going to get back to that. His brother George, who was from the first marriage of Robert Todd, was also in Richmond at the same time. And he was, we think, pro-Confederate, or else he was just mean. He was also very, very cruel to the prisoners. And in fact, when he wanted to see his brother David, David refused to see him. He had been married, and his wife divorced him for cruelty. And what he said about his sister Mary, he said she was a poor, weak-minded woman, and he was accused of looting homes and much brutality. He even sued his stepmother when their father died. I could not find what the grounds were, because that would have been all kinds of interesting, wouldn't it? And it was his mother who died in giving birth to him. So he died in 1900s, buried in South Carolina. David Humphreys Todd married a woman from Huntsville that he had met down in Selma. As I said, the family had gathered down there as their temporary home away from home. And this woman, Susan Turner Searcy Williamson was her name. Her first husband had passed away. She had 2 children from him, but he had left everything to the children and cut her out of his own will. So, and I think that she was from what I can gather, a well-to-do family. Her father had a store, a mercantile store in Huntsville. And when they got married in April 4th, 1865, then he went up to Huntsville and took over that store. April 1865. What's going on that month? A lot of things happening in his life, for sure. And a lot of people had accused him of being a spy from the South. And he said, if I could see him right now, I'd cut out his heart with my sword. And the sisters, even though, Lincoln had tried to be good to the sisters whenever they would come to visit, they were all accused of hiding goods to bring back to the South, and they accused him of part of this conspiracy. So in David Todd's case, he had to be extra cruel to prove that he was not a sympathizer for the Union. So he had filed for his application for pardon as a member of the Confederate Army on June the 22nd, 1867. It was granted that same day. It was filed in the Department of Justice on December the 18th, and the pardon says to be void and of no effect if the said David Todd shall hereafter at any time acquire any property whatever in slaves or make use of slave labor. And what's interesting is in the 1870 census, though, has his family listed there, but also about 10 servants who, would have been former slaves because they were all listed as black. When he died on July the 30th, 1871, in bed of tuberculosis, the newspaper said, Captain David H. Todd, who was a half-brother of Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, but an ardent Confederate throughout our late Civil War, died at his residence in Huntsville on the 30th. And by his request, his remains were clothed in his gray uniform as a captain of Confederate artillery with his Confederate cap in his right hand. One of the Union surgeons, Charles Gray, who had taken care of him, wrote about him in his prison diary after he heard of David's death. He said, Todd told him he was not born to die in his bed, but the doctor wrote he did die in his bed or someone else's bed. But after all, but he waited altogether too long before doing it. And one source said that he had been shot through the lung, and that's what had caused his early demise. He was only 39 years old when he died. The daughter, well, let me go back and finish about his funeral. He's buried at Maple Hill Cemetery. There is a fairly new monument there over his grave that we had put the Maple Hill Cemetery stroll about 10, 15 years ago. We had that put up. The whole Turner family was buried in one plot, but somebody later on had thought, we need to have a magnolia tree in that area. Well, those of us who have been around magnolia trees, you know that the roots are a lot of them are above ground. And so they had destroyed all of the headstones in that area. And you can see even now among the roots where the bases of some of those headstones were. So we're not exactly sure if he is under where that headstone is, and probably not, but the whole Turner family is in that same plot. And I found this out when I was walking around one day with somebody who worked at the cemetery for a long time, and he had pointed that out, told me that story, and otherwise nobody would ever know that. So it is, of course, a Confederate headstone. What's the difference? Who knows the difference between the Confederate headstones and the Union headstones?
Confederate stones are pointed.
And why?
The old Yankees sitting on them.
That's right. That's right.
What did he say? I didn't hear.
They're pointed at the top where the Union soldiers' headstones are, yeah. And the reason they said they liked the point at the top was so Yankees couldn't sit on their headstones. And then yet another source says that he died as a result of being shot in a whorehouse brawl. He only had one daughter that was his. Her name was Elise Todd, and she died in 1916 in Kentucky. She had 2 daughters and 2 sons. Her great-grandson died in 1975. And after that, I can't find anybody in Ancestry.com. They are probably out there, but because maybe they're still alive, we usually don't have that access. Susan Todd died in December of 1894 in Huntsville, and she had applied for a pension for her husband's service in the Mexican War and was awarded $8 a year. Roll it in the dough, right? Her doctor had certified that she was unable to work due to severe and chronic laryngitis, and the family was pretty much destitute at that time. So in 1961, the granddaughter of Susan Todd wrote to Mayor Speck Searcy and said, by the way, I think that we're related. And she said she had a number of items that she wanted to donate to the Historical Society. the Historical Society here have a building where you keep things?
Not yet.
Not anymore, you know, we did, Houston Memorial Library,
You don't have anything there anymore?
they put us out. We don't have a file cabinet. Yeah, we don't have a
Not yet.
place, not yet.
Do you need a file cabinet? I know somebody who has one for sale. Or to donate to a good cause. In Huntsville, we don't have one either. And it's been a real bone of contention there in Huntsville. So all of these items that she had were given to the Burritt Museum. And I don't even know if they're, I've never seen them displayed up there. I don't know. But what she had a sash. She had signatures of many of the Confederate officers, an inkwell, and a pen nib, and a Confederate flag. She also described two family portraits. One was of Susan Todd, and the other was of her younger brother, James Camp Turner. She said there was a saber wound to the portrait of Susan made by a Union soldier, and that the Yankees had poured buttermilk into the family's grand piano and had ruined it during the occupation there in Huntsville. Something else interesting, the younger brother of Susan Todd, James Camp Turner, was sent to school in France for several years, and then he went to college in Virginia, but when his mother passed away in Huntsville, he came back here, and he was here for a little while. He went back to Europe to study, but when the war broke out, he came back home and joined the 4th Alabama, and he was shot through the chest on July the 21st, 1861. What battle was that? Anybody? Manassas. July the 21st, 1861, it was Manassas. His last words, he said, "Tell my sister that I'll die happy on the battlefield in defense of my country." And he was brought back to Huntsville and was buried there. His name was on a memorial plaque in the Madison County Courthouse for Confederate soldiers who died in battle. I'm not sure it's there anymore, the whole plaque. Does anybody have any, I know you've got something to contribute to this.
One thing.
Okay.
When I went to Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln Land,
Yes.
several years ago, we were on a tour, and we went to, of course, Abraham and Mary's house, where they lived there. And they suggested that Mary Todd Lincoln suffered from diabetes untreated, and that's why she was so crazy, which of course that would be reasonable too. You know, that was what they suggested was her problem. But you learn a lot about her also, you know, in Springfield. If you've never been, it's a wonderful place to go and see all of the different things about Lincoln and his family.
Well, you know, General Forrest supposedly, they think, died also from untreated diabetes. But I don't think he was crazy like her.
She'd have gone a long time if it's diabetes though.
Well, you know, it depends on when I don't know when she developed it, you know,
Yeah.
that's just what they
But
said.
if she'd been fat since they married.
She was certainly paranoid, and supposedly she had a lot of her stock certificates or whatever sewn in the hems of her dresses. So, and she was, you know, her son had her committed to an insane asylum for a short time, and they had a big falling out over that. So I know, anybody else? I know you've got things. Yes, sir.
Regarding Lincoln.
Just to backtrack, I'm sorry, go ahead.
We'll get you both. We'll get you both.
Medical people that decided he had Marfan syndrome that long.
That was Lincoln, yeah.
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 What kind of syndrome?
Marfan syndrome, and it causes heart problems. It also makes them extra tall, and their limbs are extra long. And somebody had suggested that had he not been shot, he probably would not have survived another 6 months because of that Marfan syndrome.
You know, just to backtrack a little bit, you want to know what might have brought the Todd to Selma. There might be 3 reasons, 2 of them speculation. The Selma arsenal was down there. Did they have anything to do with it? Well, who knows? Then there was the Briarfield Iron Works. Did they have anything to do with that? I don't know. The third possibility, more likely, Selma is located in the Black Belt region of Alabama, very fertile farmland. And if they were slave owners, why not go where the crops are the best? Three speculations, but who knows?
And we may never know, but I'm certainly open now. They were there before the Civil War started, so I don't think that had anything to do with the timing. The timing would have been off. And then they did leave. He had taken a job in Illinois. The first husband that was down there had left and taken a job. And I couldn't find anything that really said what his occupation was. There's not a lot written about that particular sister and her husband.
Do you know when they settled there?
1860 is where they first show up in the census.
Well, another reason for Mary Todd perhaps being so mentally off is losing so many of her children. I think that would affect a lot of people. She had 4 boys and one lived to adulthood,
Right.
so.
And you know, there are no descendants left.
I know Robert Todd Lincoln had 3 children, and none of them had children. So after his grandchildren, no more direct descendants at least. Yeah, exactly. That's right.
You know, when, go ahead, that's okay.
I was just gonna ask, would you happen to know how many, if any at all, Susan's children or grandchildren are in that bill?
Probably none.
What was the question?
How many of Susan Todd's children or grandchildren are buried in Maple Hill? I think they left this area completely. And this woman had written from Oregon to donate these items. Again, we'll never know, because if you go to Maple Hill Cemetery and you look at the rock wall, it's kind of interesting. You will notice that there are some stones in that wall that are very perfect. And during the Civil War, the Union soldiers had camped throughout the cemetery. There was a wooden fence all around, and some of the headstones, especially the Confederates, because they had to throw something up quickly, were made out of wood. So they had taken all the fences and all those wooden headstones and burned them for firewood. And after the war was over, cows could wander through and knock over a lot of the headstones. And it was after 1900 that the city decided to build the rock wall around it. But what they discovered was some of these workers who were unsupervised were picking up loose headstones and putting them in the rock wall. So you can see, you know, you can walk around and see, there's one, there's one, there's one. They're just too perfect. And they also put them around the Masonic Lodge in downtown Huntsville as well. In fact, you can even read some of the inscriptions on that wall.
But you did say Susan is buried there, correct?
Susan is buried there. She didn't live very much longer after that. And she was too poor really to go on. So, you know, there's just not a lot of information even about her. We really didn't even know that much about her at all until the last few years. Brian Hogan, who was a really good researcher, had found that and told me that where the Todds, I don't know if they lived in this location or it was a general store, but it is on Gates Avenue, just 1 block off of the courthouse square. And there's a bank there now. Yeah. Jerry?
One point about tombstones. Appointed tombstone allegedly for Confederates. This, I understand, is to represent tents.
Oh.
And you go up into East Tennessee and you'll find cemeteries, or used to, where they would be tented in 2 slabs of stone over
Yeah.
the grave. And that was to represent they spent a lot of time in the
Camping.
field. Yeah.
There's a part of a poem I like to recite when I'm talking about Civil War history. Now you're going to make me say it. And I'm sure you all have seen a lot of this in the times in the Confederate cemeteries. On fame's eternal camping ground, their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead. Seems appropriate, doesn't it? Robert, you were going to say something?
You were talking earlier about Lincoln and Mary Todd getting together, and he was quite taken with her. First time he met her supposedly was at a dance, And he had walked across and introduced himself and said, "I want to dance with you in the worst way." To which she later replied to one of her friends, and he did.
That's good.
Well, as he was dying, after he was shot and he was unconscious, she made such a pest of herself over his bed that, I mean, they physically carried her out and said, and Edwin Stan said, "Do not let that woman come in this room." I mean, nobody had any respect for her at that time. A lot of the Todd family is buried in the Lexington Cemetery. Have any of you ever been there? I have too, yeah.
Let me ask, y'all may know, Jacque and Robert have been Maple Hill Cemetery stroll in reenactors forever. And y'all help form it. Carolyn and I too are members now, done it a number of years. But has any of the Lincoln family ever been portrayed there in our, okay? I don't
Yes,
know.
the year that we had the headstone put up for David Humphreys Todd, we had somebody that reenacted Abraham Lincoln and Mary
Yeah.
Todd Lincoln.
Huh,
And that was the one and only time.
good.
One of our, we had some very devoted Union people in Huntsville who were historians, and one of them was really angry that we had put up a headstone to him, and he wore a black armband that day to the cemetery stroll, and we didn't care.
Yeah.
We didn't.
Carolyn wanted to portray Tallulah, but they wouldn't let her really drink martinis. Yeah.
Well, she would have been a good one.
She was really good, yeah.
Yeah, we had somebody that did that for Molly Teal and fell out of her bustier. There were a lot of children.
Oh, yeah.
So she doesn't come back.
I think she'd been drinking martinis that day.
Yeah, she was. She had a flask. Yeah, she had a
Yeah.
flask. We have a lot of people that come into Huntsville and say, Lincoln Street, why did you name a street for Abraham Lincoln? Well, it's not named for him, it's actually named for Benjamin Lincoln. Does anybody know who Benjamin Lincoln was? Now here's your real history.
Revolutionary War, right?
Who said that first?
Revolution.
Right, he was the man when Cornwallis was supposed to surrender to George Washington. And if you remember from your history books, Cornwallis said something like, "I have a headache, I'm not gonna come that day. I'm gonna set my second in command to surrender my sword." And then George Washington said, "Well, I'm not gonna accept it, I'll have my second in command accept that sword." And that was Benjamin Lincoln.
Well, Green Street's also named for Revolution.
Nathaniel Green, yeah, most of those are in downtown Huntsville. All right, anybody else have any comments or questions? We have got a good little conversation going on here. All right, well, thank you so much for coming. I really am surprised that you all came out. So many people came out, and I hope it was worth your time.
Thank you.